Let's say I'm interested to push my boundaries and then my partner is not. I want threesomes and anal sex and he's like, no way, babe. What do we do? Kate Moyle, psychosexual therapist, host of the Sexual Wellness Sessions and author of The Science of Sex. Today we are talking about sexual well-being, mental health, desire, shame and communication.
Like anything in life, we can't become an expert in it unless we have learning, trial and error, we ask questions, we kind of explore. We don't have the conversations happening around us all the time about sex. We have very limited representations of sex in films and on TV and in Hollywood through pornography. If you go to porn to learn about sex, it's like learning how to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious. A lot of people have never explored even basic sensuality, like running their hands over their body or their skin, in a way which is about giving themselves permission just to see how it feels and to work out what they like. Our primary sexual relationship is with ourselves.
Are there any sex toys that you would advise to start with?
I would always say, if you are brand new to it, start with...
Welcome to Do Not Disturb, the inside story. I'm your host, Simona Deifta. What's one thing people assume about therapy that's totally wrong?
That you have to be at rock bottom or in a really bad place to access therapy. That it's only people with really bad problems that go to therapy.
Is there a book every woman should read?
Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski.
One wellness trend you just can't get into?
Just can't get into. The combination of having to do like 18 things before 6 a.m.
Totally. Pelvic floor exercises, yes or no?
Yes.
Kate, welcome to Do Not Disturb.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to have you here. All of my looks are very casual, but today I put my favorite dress on and I'm very excited. We've been prepping for this episode a lot. We have a lot of questions and I hope we can get into all of them today.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we do so, can you tell us, how did you get into psychosexual therapy in the first place?
Yeah, I think it was a kind of funny, I say funny, but I've always been the person who wanted to know how things worked, why people were kind of acting a certain way, why people were doing certain things. And I think no one who knew me as a child would be surprised that I went into kind of a people business or some kind of psychology. And then the kind of more, I suppose, like my learning developed and I started studying psychology. I got really into understanding the kind of sexual side of things. And really it went from there as quite an academic interest at first, but then I was also really intrigued as to where these conversations were happening, because it didn't look like they were happening anywhere. And it was this kind of idea that how do people deal with these problems? And so then I discovered psychosexual therapy and I went into psychosexual therapy initially, then trained as a relationship therapist and then a psychosexologist, and I've now been in the field for 10 years. And I think there's absolutely something really fascinating in the fact that these conversations aren't happening, and we see that how we manage sex as a topic in society is actually the root cause of why a lot of people are struggling with it in the first place.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's still such a huge taboo. That's what we said, when you got here. Was there a personal moment in your life that shaped your career path?
I think that actually I got kind of turned away, or I rejected, the less glamorous way of putting it, from one of the first trainings that I applied for. And at the time, I was absolutely devastated. I really kind of took it on as a personal failure. And as a result of that, I went and did a different training, and that training was really pivotal for me and really kind of set me on the course for where the rest of my career was going. And so at the time, I absolutely hated it, and I then kind of later went back and kind of tried to apply for a same course again, didn't get into it. But it was a really good learning experience for me, and also a really positive experience in that it took my learning in a different direction, and actually what turned out to be a much better direction for me. So although it felt like a failure, it actually was really kind of corner turning for me, I suppose.
It's so often like that, I think, for so many of us, women and men equally. Another question I wanted to ask about your career. As you said, you've been now 10 years in the field. What changed in your approach as you've grown?
I think confidence is massive, your confidence in your ability. I think, when you start any job, and particularly, as a therapist, you go through a lot of training before you do anything client-facing. You have to. It's really important. But there is something about finding your own way. And whilst we are governed, obviously, by a code of ethics and practice, which is super important for the work that I do in terms of safety, it's much more about kind of finding your confidence in your way within. And that is something that I think I've developed and continue to develop and will do for the rest of my career. But it's about learning to kind of settle into that, because particularly in therapy, you can do years of training, read every book, read every paper, but every client teaches you something, and that for me is it's the learning that you can't get from paper. It's experiential, and that will continue to change, I think, forever for me, because every person I work with, whether I see them for 6 sessions or 2 years, will teach me something about the human experience, which then informs more and more of my work.
That makes your job very exciting, I guess.
I absolutely love my job, because every day is different and every session is different, and there's something so, it was a word we were talking about earlier, it's very privileged that people let you into their lives in such an intimate way, and you are trusted with that, and there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. But when you can help people to make the changes that they want to make in their life, there is no better feeling.
I'm so happy to hear that, because I think many of us do need that change. And the question I had was, why do we talk about sex life, sexual well-being as a separate thing from mental health? Like, why is it still not part of mental health?
Yeah.
It's like this separate topic that lives somewhere dark pretty much at the moment. Yeah,
we haven't really integrated it into, we talk about sexual wellness and sexual well-being. I would argue that's quite a modern phrase, quite a kind of modern terminology, and largely actually that's come from the boom and development in sexual well-being products, and logically but also cynically, it's because there's a lot of money to be made in it as a market. So as soon as these kind of businesses and ideas start moving, as soon as we get investment, things grow. So it's always been this slightly kind of sectioned off part of our health or well-being. We've had this kind of difference between, even if how we talk about period products, we now talk about period products, not kind of feminine hygiene. We're starting to get to places where we're
name things what they are.
Exactly. But sexual wellness, I think, because sex has always been this hidden kind of portioned off part of our lives, we've then put that aside as well and treated it as something different. And it's been a lot of people's experience. The phrase I hear all the time from people is, I just thought this would sort itself out on its own. And I always say, but you wouldn't expect anything else in your life that's not working, and a muscular injury or a broken bone or, a problem with your mental. We don't just expect other things to magically heal themselves. And when we're talking about sexual difficulties particularly, and dysfunctions, which is my area of specialism, we have to understand that it has this bi-directional relationship where a sexual problem can cause a negative impact on someone's self-esteem, self-confidence, their mental health, their relationships. And those things can also feed back into our sex life. So we see this two-way relationship between those things. And previously, I think we've always thought, okay, well, if a problem with sex is just over here as its own separate entity, it can't touch the rest of my life. But we know from experience that that isn't the case.
For sure, I think it spills into all of your areas of life, because it's also such a hormonal impactful exercise. Like, it changes your mood, right? Changes everything. So, and I wanted to also ask, so we discussed why it's separate from mental health, but so these areas that it spills into, I'm thinking how to phrase this question better. Sex has a big role on your stress levels, on perfectionism, on your identity, on who you are. How do you unfold all of that? I mean, we can talk just about that, I think, about 3 hours. But what are the most common emotional pressures? That's probably the right question. You see coming up through discussions about sex?
Yeah, well, we talk about this thing called performance anxiety, which largely seems to centre around the conversation about kind of men's sexual wellness, but it affects everybody. And essentially, if we model this idea of sex with the fact that we can be good at sex, this idea that someone can be good at sex, and that is about following a magic formula, following a plan, that it's a recipe to be learned and kind of repeated and repeated and repeated.
Cosmopolitan. Yeah.
That if we follow that as an idea, what that leads us to believe is that there is a kind of level of expected performance that we are required to fulfill. Now, what we know is that sex is highly subjective, and that it's not as simple as that having a plan and following it, that it has to be adapted with every partner, every experience. And I think people get so caught up in the fact that they have to be good at sex, that this idea of like the things that they need to achieve, that they need to prove themselves in some way, but also that if they're not, that they're going to face judgment, criticism, that they fear it means something big about them as a person. But like anything in life, we can't become an expert in it unless we have learning, trial and error, we ask questions, we kind of explore. But with sex, we are expected to kind of not talk about it, think about it, do anything about it, and then as soon as we are kind of technically allowed to do it, or becomes the kind of legal age of consent, we're expected all to be sexual experts, or once we start exploring sex, that we should know it all and have it all worked out. And it's such a kind of unspoken narrative. You know, we talk about sexual script theory and, you know, the scripts that we follow. Oh, these are the things I should do and I should know how to do them. And it puts so much pressure on people. And then when we feel under pressure and we feel anxious, that has the ability to interrupt our sexual functioning, to interrupt our ability to be in the moment, to interrupt our pleasure, our ability to be in our bodies, to enjoy it, to even feel like we're there. You know, we talk about this idea of spectatoring, where it's almost like in films when we see that kind of pan down kind of camera from the ceiling, and it feels like we're out of ourselves. And all of these things,
I remember feeling that. Yeah.
Can happen, and they're really unspoken.
And how does therapy help us deal with all of that?
In therapy, what we do is we tend to try and get behind the problem. We try to kind of explore what's going on for someone, so what might have set it up, and then what's maintaining it, and what we can do to change it. And often a big part of my work is that we do what we call a history take, where we explore the kind of A to Z of someone, and we're finding out the rules that they live their life by, the narratives that they hold, the kind of values that they hold, and they feed into sex, whether we think that they do or not. If we have a real self-confidence knock or a self-esteem knock outside of sex, it's not a surprise that it then shows up in our sex life or in our intimate life when we're feeling more vulnerable or more exposed, or if we are
just being naked, right? I mean, it's a huge thing.
You know, emotionally naked as well as physically naked, but also, for example, if we're someone who has a tendency to be what's described as a people pleaser, we put other people's feelings first, needs first, we prioritise what's going on for them. It's not a surprise that we might be someone who struggles with letting go and with orgasm, or with kind of allowing ourselves to fully experience our own pleasure, because we're always thinking about what's going on for the other person and not us. And it's these connections can be really key in therapy, but psychosexual therapy particularly, because we don't do any kind of touch work or any hands-on work, it's just a talking therapy, it's a specialist branch of psychotherapy, also helps people to go home and explore. And we talk about getting in touch with your body, learning about your body. A lot of people don't know about their body, their anatomy, and working out how to also build that sexual relationship with yourself, which is the most important relationship that we have.
When you say build sexual relationship with yourself, what do you mean by that?
So one thing might be that people have first learned about sexual pleasure in an environment of shame, or that they felt like it was something that needed to be hidden, or that they, when they first started masturbating when they were younger, they did it in a rush because they were worried about being caught. There was this fear-based experience, or that they had, you know, sexually traumatic or difficult experiences or non-consensual sexual experiences, and that it's more functional then for them to feel kind of psychologically detached from what's happening. They're not able to kind of be in what's happening. But a lot of people also have never explored kind of even basic sensuality, like running their hands over their body or their skin, in a way which is about giving themselves permission just to see how it feels and to work out what they like. And when we know that, we can then better tell a partner or communicate that to a partner. But if we don't, we can be kind of in an experience with someone and not really knowing where to direct them or what would feel better for us.
You said about looking at where you come from and like rewiring that, or looking, what did you say, A to Z, like looking at all the emotional kind of baggage you carried up until this moment, right? And preparing for today, I was thinking about obviously how I discovered sexuality and how it changed through the years. And I thought, actually, I grew up in a divorced household, so my mom was a single mom for a very long time. There was no man around, and I just didn't see that closeness. A lot of women actually on the podcast in this season were saying, well, sex is not just sex, it's intimacy, right? I haven't seen any interaction of my mother with anyone else. And then I think when sex came into my life, I immediately kind of went all in on sex in a way. Like, sex took this overly strong presence in my life, because that was the only thing I thought kind of adults did, because I didn't see any of that. And then there was a lot of unlearning and relearning and rewiring. But then I think for other household members of my family, it did the other way around. Like, they're very not so sexual in many ways. So how the question I wanted to ask was, for women who are feeling stuck in their patterns, or for people who are feeling stuck in their patterns because of their bringing up, how do they start breaking those patterns?
Yeah, it's such a big question, because how we can't undo the experiences that we had, and we all grow up with experiences. We all grow up in some kind of, learning environment. Like if we think about like kind of life being a learning environment in terms of that, and how do we determine, why one person goes one way and one person goes, kind of complex kind of combination of psychology, genetics, environment, experiences. But if we're feeling stuck and we have a certain blueprint, so we can say like the relationships that we experience kind of growing up or around us, they can kind of set a blueprint perhaps, or they set an idea of, that's what relationships look like. And some of us seek to repair and some of us seek to repeat. And if you're feeling stuck, the question is, what would you like to be different, and what are you scared will be different, or what are you scared about, kind of, if you don't know what that difference is? Because a lot of us,
we don't, there is still no information. Where do you look for those differences? Like, where do you look for those new models of sexual well-being or sexual behavior? Well,
because a lot of us, the thing about feeling stuck or kind of repeating the patterns that we do, and this isn't always a conscious decision, is that at least we know, it's familiar. Whereas the unknown, or making the big changes, is quite a leap for a lot of people. But you're right. We don't have the conversations happening around us all the time about sex. We have very limited representations of sex in films and on TV and in Hollywood, through pornography. And we don't feel like we have spaces where we're allowed to ask questions, where we're allowed to admit that we even have questions.
Because I definitely went to porn, and then I was like, whoa, like, this is so... I'm not sure even men enjoy it, to be honest, but it's definitely not a place for women. Like, women are not centric in most porn, so that was not a good learning experience. And then there were magazines like Cosmopolitan, especially years ago. I think now they're also evolving, but it was all about pleasure and pleasuring your man, and it's definitely not about self-discovery that you talk about. So
I think we've made a lot of headway with that, and I would say a lot of the kind of women's magazines now are much more focused on that idea of self-discovery. And these kind of definitions have become more expansive as well, but the reality is that pornography is most people's easily accessible sex information, and I use kind of sex information kind of within quotation marks, because it wasn't designed to be an educational tool. It was designed to be something which created arousal. And so a lot of people are going for information about sex there, but there's a quote, and I never know who said it, and I really need to find out because I use it a bit, which is that if you kind of go to porn to learn about sex, it's like learning how to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious. There's some similarities, but they are completely different experiences. And we have to examine the fact and understand the fact that there is a huge gap between these things, that they do not perfectly translate.
So where do we go?
Other. Well, this is where we hope that sex educators, therapists who are writing books, podcasts, like putting this information out there, is becoming more widely known now.
Would you recommend discussing this with friends more openly, or that can be quite a blurry experience as well, because people still don't speak about it openly, and then you just get bits and blobs and you end up feeling worse?
Yeah, I think that it's about what you want to get from those conversations. A lot of people are starting to kind of talk to their friends about sex, and again, I guess the question becomes, why do you feel like you can't? And often it's because, I'll be embarrassed, or I'm worried they'd judge me, or they're going to think I'm weird, or I feel shame, and shame keeps us silent. But I think a lot of people, if they had those conversations with their friends, and this is something I get reported back to me a lot as a therapist, is, I asked a friend, or I started talking about it, and everyone else could tell me a story about something they've struggled with, or how they did something, or what they tried. And I suddenly realised I've been going from this feeling of being like, I'm the only one, I'm completely isolated in my experience, to something very different, which is, this is quite common. But the thing that isn't common is how often we talk about it. I am a big believer we should talk about it more with therapists and with friends, and normalizing these conversations in general. Of course, you have to be respectful of your partner's privacy and whatever their wishes, but it's definitely a conversation to be had. Just like we would talk about, like you said, a broken arm or a muscle sprain. I mean, we talk about this, right? So why not talk about other parts of our well-being? Well, I think that people think that if we talk about sex, that in some way it's something that's private or to be protected, but which for some people they might feel like that. A lot of people don't want to talk about sex, and that's fine for them. But for the people who are struggling and would like some advice or some thoughts from a friend, or just to be able to say, I'm really struggling with this thing and it's causing me a lot of anxiety and a lot of distress and I don't know what to do with it, we stop ourselves then from accessing some kind of help or some kind of potential information. And that's where we see the problem. So the people that are happy not talking about it, that's fine for them. It's not that everyone has to seek out this stuff, but it's the people that are struggling that feel like the lack of conversation is a barrier. And I would argue that feeling isolated in an experience of having a sexual difficulty is the most common side effect of having one. And it completely compounds what's going on for someone.
Yeah, equally for men and women, there can be quite a lot of physical dysfunctions that create that level of isolation. I wanted to talk about sexual stereotypes.
Okay.
Some, I've written them down as well.
So many.
Yes, some that, I grew up listening to. Men want more sex than women. Good mothers aren't sexual. You should want sex all the time or there is something wrong with you. Nice girls don't initiate. If you're in love, sex should just work naturally. Otherwise, there is no love. Obviously, you just fell out of love. And when I read this, I go like, this was like my core belief system probably for years and years and years. And I'm sure it is for many of us.
Yeah. How
do we start unlearning these? And how do we start changing stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the really, really common ones. And even though we can say them out loud now as adults and recognise that there might not be logic in them or that we don't believe them necessarily anymore, they are the ideas that kind of shaped us in our early years, and we couldn't kind of step back and say, actually, is that how I want to think? And we get a lot of these ideas internalized and embedded through what people say, what we hear people saying, the kind of everything from, TV to the mass media to kind of messages from parents to sex education or no sex education. And it's also a lot in the unsaid. And one example that you kind of gave there is, if we're in love, sex will just work. And what it means is that when it's not working, we immediately panic and we think that there's something wrong with us, something wrong with our relationship, that there's also that it's unsolvable. And I think that's one of the things that, again, stops people from getting help. Whereas no partner can be a mind reader. No one can know what's going on in their partner's head unless you tell them. But we aren't taught that these are the conversations that we should be having. We aren't taught that we should be able to say to our
because
partner,
you should just be sexy and wanted all the time, right?
Yeah. And that we should be desirable to our partners all the time. That sex is always, always in context, and it is not a static part of our lives and a static entity in our lives, but we treat it like it should be, which means that the minute it changes, it has to be a problem. Whereas if we start to kind of unpack that and we say, okay, well, people are more happy to accept that sex has changed, for example, with a change, let's say, post the birth of a baby, or they've had an operation, or, where there's a reason for it. They can kind of understand that it's not happening, but they have the trust and the faith that it will come back when the context, the kind of conditions are right. But when we feel like we don't have an explanation for it, that's when people start to get really worried about it. And a huge amount of the time, we relate kind of sex to how it was at the start of a relationship. And one of the most predictable things about sex in relationships is that it will change, and it will change forever, and it will go through different phases and different stages. But we aren't taught that. That's not the conversation that I see happening. And I think if we were kind of taught from these earlier conversations, or when we started relationships, that, this is the part of your relationship which will kind of go around corners and twists and turns and have good days and bad days and average days. And like everything else, like the rest of your relationship, like if you become parents, like your job, like your fitness levels, like your diet, like everything, like your mental health, then we would fear the changes so much less, and we would work with them rather than against them.
And are there known stages of sex change within relationship?
Yeah, so typically at the start of relationships, and I say typically because it's not always the case, people report having more regular sex, that they report higher levels of desire, they're more motivated to be sexual with their partners, they're kind of having sex more regularly, and we see that this typically kind of peters out after about a year to 2 years. And again, this is a general trend. And then sex moves to something perhaps that happens less often, but also often the quality can be better because we know our partners, we know their bodies, we know what they like a bit more, we're more familiar. So the benefit of being more familiar can kind of change things. Now, anything can change our relationship with sex. So sex becoming painful, uncomfortable, a hormonal change or imbalance, a medication change or imbalance, trying to conceive, miscarriage, struggling to conceive, having a baby, being pregnant, anything that makes us feel ill or unwell or different in our bodies. And obviously we then have big kind of changes like menopause. And we know that before that we have perimenopause, which can be years of things changing. It can change, what we talk about biopsychosocially, so biologically and physically, socially, as in our experience kind of in the world, our messages and thoughts and feelings, so the psychology of these things. And but at any point, anything can change our sex lives. We could be acutely stressed and unable to switch off, unable to not be distracted by what's going on all the time.
And in those points, how do we communicate to our partner that we need that gap, or we need that time, or we need sex or don't need sex to make it safe and acceptable for him or her?
Well, we have to communicate to them because they can't know unless we do. And when there is a communication gap, we tend to fill the information gaps with our assumptions, and our assumptions tend to be negative. So if you asked people, what their most kind of natural assumption would be if it felt like sex had suddenly changed and their partner wasn't initiating contact with them anymore or wasn't approaching them anymore. If you said to them, what's like the first thought that would come to your head? Most people would say, oh, I think I'm not attractive to my partner anymore. Because that's also what we're taught. It goes back to those myths you had there. Like, I have to be attractive to my partner all the time. And actually, I would say a huge amount of time that is not the case. But it's that something else is going on. But if we don't have the tools to know how to even open up the conversation or even how to say to our partner, can I talk to you about something at the moment? I'm actually finding that I'm feeling really distracted during sex. I'm finding it really difficult to get into the moment. I'm feeling really anxious and I can't quite explain why. Then you can start something. But we fear that so much because these are not the conversations that we're taught to have.
And in the moments when you say, let's say 1-2 years passed and we had our, wild sex period and now we're in a stable, good relationship with the quality sex happening, how often are we supposed to be having sex?
Yeah, this is the one question that I think I get on every podcast I go on.
Really?
The real answer is as often as you want to. But most typically, people are not perfectly sexually aligned. So it's a negotiation between the difference between the two of you. Because it's very rare, a bit like how we don't expect our partners to be perfectly matched with us with everything else, from food taste to seasoning to sleeping habits, kind of exercise habits. We don't expect to be like carbon copies of each other. But somehow, when it comes to sex, we do. And it's about negotiating that difference between the two of you. Now, what's also possible when it comes to sex in a relationship is that it means something different to both people. So the why plays a really important role. It's not just about the what of what we're doing. And if we have, for example, a period where we might not be having the act of sex, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a good sex life. If we feel that our partner still approaches us, that we are still kind of attractive or interesting to them, or that they still desire us, or that we still flirt, or that we still have touch for touch's sake. We can navigate those times without the act of sex if we feel like we still have a sexual connection. And that's why focusing on sex is literally just an act, and often when we talk about the act, we talk about it being kind of intercourse or penetrative sex, is so reductive in so many ways.
I understand that you touched on, pregnancy being obviously, or trying to conceive could be those times when we have less sex. And in my first pregnancy, I didn't have a lot of sex. And I felt so rejected. I felt so ugly. I felt so it was really hard for me. Whereas in the second pregnancy, I'm like, you know what? We still touch. We are, friends, I feel desired. He's just worried about the baby, and it's okay. He also has the right to have it's actually not about me at all.
Yeah.
And it was such a liberating feeling to have. And sometimes we have sex more, sometimes we have sex less, but just realizing it's not even about me. I was so egocentric and selfish, I can't believe it, but I was meant to believe those things, because I need to be desired, right? Sex is the marker of successful relationship, as we said. But actually, there's so many other things that you just mentioned to look out for.
Yeah.
Does he want to take my hand? Does he want to snuggle on the sofa? I'm clearly desired, but he's worried about the baby, and it's okay.
Yeah. And if it taps into, if a lack of sex, for example, or a lack of sexual initiation or approach, or whatever term we want to use for it, if that meets us at a point of anxiety for us, or a negative belief about ourselves, or a fear, or something we've been told, or something that's happened to us in a previous relationship, and it meets us at a point of, oh, I believe this about myself, we can use that as a kind of confirmation bias for the fact that it confirms what we believe about ourselves. So if we are, unattractive, or we are...
I always struggle with weight, and now I'm obviously bigger than ever. And then that just kind of tapped right into my belief system, limiting belief system about my inner critic, and that just kind of amplified it 100 times. And it I don't know how I did it. I should have got a session with you, but I think it was like a moment, okay, let's just take myself out of the picture for a second. Let's like look at it as if a friend of mine came to me for advice.
Yeah.
What would I tell her? And then I kind of unpicked the whole thing.
Yeah.
But it was a very difficult thing for me because it exactly tapped into all of those, how do you call these things?
Like insecurities.
Yeah, all the insecurities that I had about myself already. So
yeah, and that's the thing that we can do sometimes if we are going through these processes of kind of circular thinking or rumination, where it's just us and our own opinion and no outside information. Is, I often say to people in therapy, if your best friend said that to you, or if your sister said that to you, how would you respond? You know, what would you say to someone else who told you that? And they'd say, that sounds really hard, or there are loads of things that you can do to help yourself, or like, that doesn't sound okay, or you shouldn't be having sex if it's causing you pain, and they hear themselves say it and they're like, I'm not giving myself the same grace or consideration that I would give someone else. And that is a point that we can then work with, because it's a process of externalizing and putting it on to the table and outside of ourselves, whereas we are our own harshest critics. Typically, most of us struggle with confidence in some way, shape or form, whether it's self-confidence, body confidence, sexual confidence, and we have to kind of contend with that. But if it's unvocalized, then it can kind of be a losing battle with ourselves. And what we do know about sexual concerns, particularly because we have this added layer of taboo that sits around them generally, is that we can get into these really vicious cycles of kind of anxiety, preoccupation, distraction, struggling physically, which kind of confirms our worst fears, which feeds into more anxiety, which feeds into things kind of getting worse.
That doesn't sound like a good place to be having a good sexual life. No.
Exactly. And distraction is absolutely killer for both desire, which is our motivation and our want to do something sexual, which is largely psychological, and arousal, which is our body's process of preparing or getting ready for a sexual experience. And as soon as we introduce distraction, our brain is in a different place. We're off somewhere else. And if you think about the world that we live in right now, it thrives on distraction, devices, notifications, things kind of going off all the time, beeping all the time. We designed to be in a million different places at once, and then sex, and good sex, requires being in the moment in one place. Do not disturb. In one place and completely focused on what is happening for you in that moment, and allowing yourself to do that. And it's becoming something that is rarer and rarer. And it takes more work, it takes more intention, it takes more practice.
Do you think that is, I don't have statistics on that, but more and more young people are not having sex at all?
Yeah.
Do you think that is the core reason why? Because there's so much distraction and other ways of kind of get your dopamine levels up. PlayStation, whatever. Uber Eats, are we losing sex for the modern society?
We have a piece of research which is called the NatSal survey, and what that is a kind of really big survey done in the UK every 10 years, and what we have seen is decade on decade, for the last 3 decades, people are reporting having less sex.
Yeah.
Yes, we could probably point the finger at technology for playing a big part in that. We saw research from, I can never remember if it's the 80s or 90s, but found that people who had TVs in their bedroom reported having less sex. And now, if you think about it, most of us have, 2 TVs, if not more. And
phones.
Exactly, like mini screens. We're both kind of there with our own essentially equivalent of a TV. And it is distracting. It takes our attention. We miss cues from our partner. We're less likely to reach out to our partner if they're kind of typing away or immersed in something. We kind of think, they're not interested. And we have to kind of work harder to interrupt these things, and the moments where we have to be more intentional, where we have to change things, where we have to kind of practice actually putting positive habits in place, because such as do not disturb, having time without technology, saying, okay, shall we make our bedroom a phone-free zone, or shall we make sure we turn off our phones or put them onto flight mode, or whatever we do not disturb, 20 minutes before we get into bed? Shall we make a habit to try and go to bed at the same time? Shall we? And obviously people often now, most, particularly like in the UK, most couples are working, both partners, different schedules, different jobs, different. If you chuck children into the mix, kind of running a household, like everything that goes in between, people who are doing shift work, sometimes those moments where we're actually crossing over are quite few, but then how do we harness them? And I think that creating positive habits around this stuff takes intention. But again, if we go back to those myths that you talked about earlier, good sex or a sex life should just happen. And then we have to fight with the belief that this is something that we need to work at. And we think that if we are having to work at it, or we are having to be intentional,
it's wrong already, yeah.
that we're already doing something wrong, or that it shouldn't be this hard, or we shouldn't have to do that. Therefore, we think there's a problem. And it's all of this stuff which sits underneath sex, which, is the, you said, how do we explore this in therapy? These are a lot of the conversations that I would be having with people.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this conversation, take a second to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It really helps us keep bringing you these honest conversations that rarely happen but really matter. Now, back to it. What other myth have you come across?
I think the initiation one is really interesting, that we typically see myths about that men should always start sex. Bear in mind, these are very gendered and very heteronormative. So again, a lot of these myths are based on the assumption that it's a man and a woman having sex. And we know that there are plenty of people not in heterosexual relationships who are having sex and having great sex lives. But again, it puts the pressure on one partner to start something, the other to respond, or that the other should always be ready to respond. And where you have couples who that isn't the case for, there becomes a kind of ingrained or internalized shame or idea that they're different, when actually it shouldn't really matter at all.
And if, let's say, your partner's initiating and you're not in the mood, that can feel quite rejecting. Obviously it is rejecting, but it can feel like personal rejection to the other partner, whereas again, you might just be tired, or you just had a baby, or whatever, your hip hurts. So how do we normalize also in the moment of initiation communicating the needs, whatever they are?
Yeah, and I think we have to be able to communicate to our partner, and we can do it with love. It doesn't have to be like a no. It can be like, is there something else we can do, or I'm really not in the mood, or could we put some time in tomorrow, whatever it is. But also
something else we can do, like non-penetrative sex, or okay.
Yeah, another thing that we have to look at is how we understand desire.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are, okay, so how would you define desire?
How would I define desire? Well, my definition changes actually every month nowadays, every week I would say. But for me, it's not about sex anymore. It's like, even if my partner just looks at me and goes like, oh honey, I'm so happy you're here, I'm happy. Like, that has not been, even 3 years ago, if we are not having sex like bunnies, I would be pretty disappointed.
Okay.
Yeah. So for me, desire, I think, is feeling appreciated and loved. And right now, my partner's in John Lewis buying all the baby things. That's the hottest thing on my list right now. Yeah.
So what I love that you've done there is you were saying how your idea about desire has changed.
Yeah.
And okay.
I'm very hormonal. I'm crying every episode.
Whereas if you said to a lot of people, how does desire look? Like, tell me what desire is, they'd say, oh, sex like it is in the movies.
Yeah.
You get through the front door, ripping each other's clothes off, and like it's kind of, people use words like animalistic. It's like someone wants you, and that is the kind of Hollywood version. It's also the version that we see people typically experience more at the start of relationships, and it's where we know that everything is working for you. So the novelty is there, the excitement, the curiosity, you're getting to know someone, and everything's on your side. Your brain's on your side, your kind of neurochemicals are on your side. Like our brain loves novelty, and that's how we're getting to know someone. So everything is working with us, but we habituate, we get used to people, we get used to things get predictable, more routine, which also is important for when we're establishing relationships, for which are going to go forward on a more kind of long-term basis or have a bit more longevity, because we have to be able to kind of get back to our jobs and our lives to be able to integrate that person into the rest of our lives. So we have this kind of security, safety element, and also then the kind of injection and satisfaction and novelty and eroticness that the relationship kind of has a lot for the start. So we see these two things kind of balancing out. But what happens at the start of relationships is we have lots of things that kind of promote what we call spontaneous desire, so that I feel really like sex kind of out of the blue. Typically, actually, it's that something has kind of brought sex to mind, or sex with that person to mind, or we feel like there's kind of more erotic charge, or it's more exciting. We're presented with more of that stuff. We kiss more at the start of relationships, touch more, flirt more eye contact, all of the things that are, again, helping to kind of push us into that kind of more like erotic space. Responsive desire, which is much more typical, particularly in long-term relationships, is where we start something first and the desire to continue emerges, or the desire is triggered by the starting of something kind of physical and sexual. But the biggest thing about this, which is totally normal and totally expected, is that we think, because we don't have that feeling we had at the start, that the change is a problem, whereas actually this transition is just experiencing desire in a different type of way. And when we know that, we can harness it. And when we know that, we can say, do you know what? I know what really helps me to move into that space is to have shut down my work emails, to have had a shower and use that shower gel I really like the smell of, or to change the lighting in my bedroom, or to move the pile of laundry off the floor so that I'm not lying in my bed looking at it, or to have done something that helps me to psychologically kind of cue myself into a different state, or to spend 5 minutes of like kissing and touching before we try and jump into something more sexual, or when we sit and have dinner together and I feel closer to my partner, or we've walked the dog, or whatever it is. Context is key, and if we know what works for us, we can do something with that and do something about it.
But then you do hear about couples who've been 20 years married and they still rip each other clothes and have Hollywood sex.
Yeah.
Are there any tips to do that in a longevity of the relationship?
The couples that do that
Lie. No.
The couples that do that have made sex a priority, and they work at their sex life intentionally.
Does that mean taking weekends away without kids? Does that mean experimenting? What?
It means whatever it looks like for them. But curiosity is great for our sex lives. Novelty is great for our sex lives. It's about not letting it slip. It's about paying attention to it. It's about continually talking about it. But the thing that is consistent across couples who report having good sex lives, however long they've been together, is that they work at it and that they intentionally make it a priority. And it's not a problem that they're doing that. And in fact, it's a really good thing. They don't see it as a problem.
You said curiosity and novelty. That can mean so many different things to different people. What is curiosity? Curiosity with the same partner, curiosity with different partners, curiosity in like trying the whole Kama Sutra. What is a curiosity? Yeah,
I mean, curiosity for anything, from shall we put the pillows on a different end of the bed? Shall we try having sex in a different room? Shall we try a different position? Shall we introduce a sex toy? Shall we use lube? Shall we... Anything which makes sex... Often what happens when it comes to sex is we get into a routine and then we don't deviate from the routine. But the predictability has a dampening effect on desire. It's less exciting for us. And sex is a motivation and a motivator. If it's good and we're satisfied, we're motivated to do it again. If it's not satisfying, if we are really distracted, we're not experiencing pleasure, we feel like psychologically we're in a different place, that we know exactly what's going to happen, and so we're not really kind of anticipating it in a positive way, it gets less satisfying, it gets less motivating, we're less kind of, drawn towards or pushed towards doing it again.
Where can I find tips online or offline or in a book, or how, like putting a pillow, putting a candle, this I can understand, but let's say I'm not educated on sex and I want to try positions and I don't want to feel like a porn star. Where do I start that?
Oh, there are a million articles online about sex positions. There are so many great books as well. I mean, obviously I'll drop my book in here.
Yes, please.
Which has bits about positions, but it's also about feeling your way and what works for you. Is it something as simple as sex was always a bit uncomfortable for you and you've put a pillow under your hips? It's changed the angle of your hips, or changed the angle of penetration, and that's made a massive difference to you. A lot of the stuff isn't rocket science, but it's about giving people permission to also try these things. And one of the things I talk about is every time you have sex or are kind of sexual with your partner, change one thing. That could be starting with the lights on or the lights off. It could be not taking off your clothes and getting into bed, but undressing each other. It could be, I don't know, like giving each other a massage, introducing lube, or focusing on only one of you for that evening, or deciding not to have penetrative sex but to do other things. And it's kind of the curiosity bit is really as far as your imagination will take you within the bounds of what you both feel is comfortable and that you're okay with. And that's the thing that I would encourage people to do. Again, it's about not following something, but being like, oh, I would be interested in this. What do you think?
Few more questions on this. Sorry, I have a lot of questions, but let's say I'm interested to push my boundaries and curiosity and try different things, and then my partner is not.
Yeah.
What then it becomes another tension point and negotiation. Maybe I'll move him a little bit, but you can be fairly quickly, just like with any self-development and self-discovery, you can quite quickly escalate along this path.
Yeah.
And here I want, I don't know, threesomes and anal sex, and he's like, no way, babe. What do we do?
Yeah, and again, it's about how do you negotiate the differences in your relationship. Now, if people are in a monogamous relationship and they're kind of, adhering to their rules of monogamy, then immediately that's going to take out a lot of sexual exploration. But are there ways that they can explore that they both feel comfortable with? If you approach that conversation with your partner and you get a hard no, then try to kind of not take it as a personal rejection of you, but think about it as a rejection of the act, because often what can happen is we then completely shut down. Be prepared for the fact that their response might not be the same as yours, because you've already rehearsed the conversation in your head. You're comfortable with what you want to say, how you're going to say it. It's new to them. So you already kind of are a step ahead. If you then feel able to, give them a chance to think about it, and you can say to them, okay, well, what is it about that's a no for you? Is there something that is a yes or is a maybe? And an exercise that people can often do is create a yes, no, maybe list and then kind of share them with each other. These are really good things for kind of starting these conversations. But
that is probably also a nice way to actually get the arousal and put sex back on the table in the couples. Even making a list like this is a nice way of connecting back to the sexual life.
It's as important with sex to know your no as it is to know your yes. And what it does is it then allows you to work with that. And so someone might say, do you know what, that feels like a bit too much for me, but we could try this. Or we could try something, a small step or a simple kind of step to start that or to shift something. And that is how people also explore new things together. They might both feel a bit cautious about it, but that's also okay. You're trying anything new together. And it's about understanding that also their anxieties and their no's are theirs and they are allowed to have them, but also that there might be a negotiation, a difference, a space that you can work in together, which is comfortable for both of you.
Yeah, I guess it's not one against another. The way to think about it's two of you exploring something new.
Yeah.
Just like deciding where to go on vacation. Like
it's a really deciding where to go on holiday is a really good analogy, but also we shouldn't in any way be forcing partners to have sex that they don't want to have. And so you have to listen to what your partner is saying, and they might be saying it from a negative previous experience, from a fear that they have, and that's why the conversation's about what is it that is a no for you about this? What is it that scares you about this or makes you anxious about this? Be curious as to their response. Don't just hear it as a door slam or a kind of pushing away, like a kind of separation between the two of you.
And it can be an answer in that moment as well. Like, we are all very fluid. There are other ways of having sex, obviously, other than with your partner. You can have sex with yourself, and self-pleasure is a big part of sexual well-being. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that and how, I don't know a lot about men, but I think women are still not embracing it in many ways. I told you off camera, for me a dildo or a vibrator was like this disgusting, thing you buy on a dodgy website. But then I came across a brand that you work with, Lelo, and all of a sudden it was like so feminine and so cool and so beautiful, and that changed the whole concept of self-pleasure for me. Yeah. But could you talk about from your perspective and then from perspective of the clients that you work with and how it also influences couples? So quite a lengthy.
I think that, well, one of the first things to say is that our primary sexual relationship is with ourselves. And, you asked me earlier about like, what is this kind of getting to know our bodies look like? Most people learn about their kind of sexual responses, what they like, through self-pleasure, through masturbation. And where they kind of then come up to meet, introducing other people into it is where kind of solo sex becomes partnered sex. Now, what can happen is that if people feel like they've kind of learnt to masturbate in a very particular way and they don't know how to ask questions, what to do, what to change, they can get quite set in their ways, which can sometimes kind of struggle to translate into coupled experiences. But that's rare. Most people are using it as a initial platform, but they are not mutually exclusive. Just because you're partnered or in a relationship doesn't mean that you also can't engage in solo pleasure. It's about doing something that makes your body feel good, doing something you enjoy. It's that kind of gift to self, but also building a sexual relationship with yourself. And for a lot of people, it's how they engage with themselves, but also it's a feel-good experience. Your body is designed to experience pleasure. Like we see this kind of mapping of nerve endings all over the body. We've got the somatosensory cortex in the brain, which corresponds to the density of nerve endings and like how the body feels, how touch is explored. And then when you introduce something like sex toys, they are a tool to be used. The historical messaging largely was, these are a threat to sex. These are a threat to your relationship.
Many people still feel like if they engage in self-pleasure, it's almost like cheating on your partner.
Mm. And I think that's like a lot about the messages that people hold or the narratives that people hold, which is that, for example, a very, I would say very outdated but very historical message is people who use sex toys are only doing it because they're dissatisfied in their sexual relationships, and we know that that is completely not true. But they are a tool to be used, something to introduce different sensuality, different experiences, different types of pleasure, and as commonly used by couples as they are by individuals. So Lelo, who's the brand that you mentioned, they've won amazing numbers of design awards. These are like beautiful products. They are made from top grade silicone. They have years of kind of investment and investigations before they kind of come to get to the shelf. But they are specifically designed as these pleasure products which also don't have to look phallic, don't have to look like body parts. They are designed to be kind of almost like little works of art, and that it's about also giving people permission and working out what people want. And often people want to feel comfortable with the product that they're using. They want to like the colour, like the design. It's not going to work for you if you feel
and let's say I'm a person who is afraid of sex toys, but I am in that curiosity path with my partner or with myself. I am ready to invest. They are expensive in this context, toys. I'm ready to invest some money in buying some sex toys for myself and for my partner. Are there any sex toys that you would advise to start with?
I would always say if you are brand new to it, start with a really simple, just kind of multi-setting vibrator. Run it all over your body, not just on the genitals, not just on the parts of the body normally associated with sex, but use it all over your body. Get used to the sensation, get used to the feeling. With sex toys, yes, like Lilo are at the top of the market, but they are a market leader. They've won design awards. They use kind of really high-end materials. When you're thinking about a sex toy, what it's made from is also important. You want to be using something like body-safe silicone, because if you're using kind of cheap materials, things that are not designed to be body-safe, then what that material can do is it can kind of like take on bacteria, and then that can kind of be harboured or grown, and actually puts you at risk of infection. Sex toys always need to be cleaned before use. And so, like anything that we kind of put in and on our bodies, we sometimes need to think about what we're doing. But if you're doing it with a partner and it's something that you've talked about, look at the website together, have a look, be like, I like the look of that one looks terrifying, that's not for me. Or what about this, that sounds interesting. And that, again, is a really good way of starting the conversation. But there are differences now. We've got really kind of simple vibrators. For clitoral stimulation, we've got kind of suction toys, which are kind of more about kind of creating this kind of sense of suction around the clitoris, which is a different type of pleasure. But it's a multi-billion pound market now. It's so huge, and it can feel intimidating in terms of that, kind of knowing where to start. But those are some of the basics that I would do, and you can always build on that and expand on that kind of as you please.
And if your partner doesn't want to use the toys, should you feel okay to just experiment in your own time in those moments when maybe there was a rejection of initiation, or there is just one is working, or those shift nights? Should women or men feel, totally normal self-pleasuring themselves in their free time?
Yeah, they should. It becomes a problem in relationships when people think that it's a problem, and often it is thought to be a problem when it comes from a place of insecurity or defensiveness, or I feel like I'm not doing a good enough job. It's like a supplement thing, or that it's a because of. And actually, if we see that the two are not mutually exclusive and that they can be used alongside each other and that they can complement each other really well, then it's not a threat. But often we feel like it comes from a place, and a lot of the messaging is that it comes from a place where, you weren't good enough.
Yeah.
And that isn't the case.
So for someone who feels like that, let's say for a partner, is there a phrase you would recommend to say to communicate that to another person?
I think that it's just about saying, like, this is giving me something different. This isn't taking anything away from us. And I think that's the assumption. It comes from this like lack of enough mindset, this kind of scarcity mindset, that there's only so much, and that if it takes away from us, then that's a problem. But actually, these two things can sit alongside each other really nicely.
Parenthood.
Yes.
How does becoming a parent changes your sex life?
I think the question is, are there any ways that becoming a parent doesn't change your sex life? Yeah, massively. The resources that help us sexually, time, sleep, energy, headspace, quality time spent together, touch for touch's sake, massively, massively interrupted and reduced by being parents. And not just parents of babies, but the whole way through. And we have to work harder at our sex lives when we're parents and we're in this phase, because just even finding each other among the parentness can in itself be a bit of a challenge. And so then kind of finding each other and then leaning into sex, sometimes dipping into our energy reserves, which we might feel are way lower than they've ever been. But we also see that it's a time where we're kind of battling it out. We see that couples can be really aligned, but often it's this kind of table tennis match of I did more, or I did this, or you didn't do that. And it's again about kind of taking baby steps back towards each other, and also accepting that it will change, and that also that's okay, and that we can continue to again try to work at it despite all of that stuff.
Anything from your practice that really helped couples get it all back together? Everyone on the podcast saying weekends alone, taking time away, obviously, from the children. But anything like you hear recurringly that you would say couples mention?
People have quite a response to it. But it's not about scheduling sex. It's about scheduling time to be together. We schedule everything: our work meetings, our gym classes, doctor's appointments, school meetings. But we don't schedule stuff to do with our relationships. And when we are parents, and particularly parents of young children, we need to put that time aside for us. And what it isn't about is scheduling sex, because what that can do is it can create pressure and anticipation. But it's about saying, okay, Tuesday night, like, we're going to put the kids down and we're going to just lie on our bed for half an hour, because that might be all we have. But it's a way for us to kind of have some time connecting. We're going to deprioritize everything else, because the laundry will never be done. The toys will never all be picked up. We're never going to have kind of sterilized everything at exactly the moment that it needs to be done, or kind of made all of the weaning foods. But we are going to put us first, even if it's for half an hour, and then we can go back to the other stuff. And it's about acknowledging that kind of to-do list to do with parenting, that invisible workload, won't ever disappear fully. So we have to sometimes put ourselves first within that.
That makes total sense to me. What about the, I think it's 6 weeks guideline that you should be having sex after having a baby, and there is a big pressure, I think, for women to bounce back. I was lucky enough to have a natural delivery first time, but then, women rip, women cut, it's sore, you're leaking, you're not in. How do we deal with that bounce back pressure? I
mean, even the phrase bounce back is, when you think about it, an extraordinary phrase. But yeah, so the recommendation, at least in the UK, is that you don't have penetrative sex until a minimum of 6 weeks postnatally. You also need to be using contraception from that point onwards if you're starting to have sex again, because you are at risk of becoming pregnant. It's a rough guideline, but obviously some people have episiotomies, so where they're cut, as you say, tearing. We also know that when we're breastfeeding, prolactin can have a negative effect on estrogen levels, which means that vaginal dryness is more common when we're breastfeeding, something that we're not told about a lot, so that can make sex more painful.
I didn't know that, yeah.
But also, most people aren't really thinking about sex at that point. It doesn't even feel on their radar. They're kind of in the carnage of having a newborn. And it's about working out, like we talked about earlier, are there other ways that you can connect? Are there little moments that you can have, the kind of gold dust, the glimmers of, okay, like, we're still here? Because the couple that you once knew is likely to feel very different in this stage of your life to who you were, and sometimes you don't even recognize yourselves or each other. And so working out ways that you can continue that or maintain that connection, even if it's just, a kiss in the kitchen for a minute, is enough to pull you through that time, if you believe and you have the trust that when your context starts to shift a bit, or when things kind of are moving forward, or when you have a bit of time, that those opportunities can be taken.
And in your practice, when does that usually happen? Is that 6 weeks? Is that 10 weeks? Is that what's the time frame on?
Yeah, it's as long as a piece of string. I would say it's not 6 weeks. I don't think people get back to that.
I don't think it's 6 weeks either.
No, because just even time, the time you have is so limited, and don't put pressure on yourself to be hitting a certain point at a certain date, at a certain week. But it's much more for you about being like, okay, do you know what? I really miss you, or I miss us, or I want to kind of make a bit of space psychologically for this, or how are we going to help ourselves?
Because so many women tell me on the podcast, I just wanted to get over it.
Yeah.
Like, that's something like a cloud over your head that you just want to get over with and be done with it and kind of reopen. I find it's quite traumatizing when I hear that. But could be also a good way, kind of you've done it and you're back on it. So what is the advisable? It's an ironic kind of term, but baby steps. It's about, you don't have to jump straight back into penetrative sex. It might feel physically quite different, particularly depending on the kind of birth you've had. Obviously, people with birth trauma, we have a whole different kind of layer of stuff going on for them. But your pelvic floor
has also been under intense pressure during pregnancy, during childbirth, and sensation might be different for a while. And for some people, if they've had something like an episiotomy, where it can actually feel tighter, and that can be a real surprise to people because they've had stitches, scar tissue is less elastic than kind of normal tissue, and it's about understanding where you're at, taking your time with it, and not putting pressure on yourself to kind of have jump straight back in at the deep end. But you can take gradual steps. There's a great book by a colleague of mine called Dr. Karen Gurney called How Not to Let Having Kids Ruin Your Sex Life. I'd highly recommend that. We've had the discussion on my podcast, but also it's about physically giving yourself a chance to recover. Like, your body has been through so much. If you are breastfeeding particularly, you might feel quite touched out, like there's like lots of little hands on you all the time. If you're juggling, you know, an older child and a baby, that is also, I think, a thing that's not really talked about, is women particularly do feel a bit touched out, and then sex can feel like another type of touch, and it can feel a bit like their body is currently for someone else. And then sex on top of that, if they're not feeling sexual or back to a version of their sexual selves, can feel a bit like doing something for someone else again. And so it's working out also how you can start to rebuild that sense of kind of sexual self for you first.
In the first place, for sure. There are many couples, I was asked to ask you that, there are many couples, you know, who's been in a relationship for a long time. They can be loving partners, they can be wonderful parents, but then, you know, maybe one partner goes on that curiosity path, another one doesn't, and then infidelity arises. And they can't even label it as infidelity because often emotionally the partner is still there, it's just the sex that feels like cheating. How do we address this whole other part of our relationship?
I love a quote from Esther Perel about infidelity, where she says, we're not looking for a different version of our partners, but we're looking for a different version of ourselves. And what I think it highlights is how the motivations for people having affairs are so varied, but often it's a kind of seeking of something that we feel is missing. Now, the lines of what people define as infidelity or not, really like that couples to decide for them. So some people might describe watching pornography as cheating. Some people might describe sexting someone else, or scrolling through dating apps, or DMing someone on social media. For other people, it has to be something touch-based or something physical. Where that line is for you is important for you to know and for your partner to know, because then you can work with that. But, you know, the thing about infidelity is that it rips the trust in a relationship apart. And for a lot of people that can't be rebuilt. For some people it can, but it takes a lot of work to get back to that, because if you're in a kind of committed relationship, you giving something to another person and trusting them not to throw that back at you or not to hurt you with that is often what's happened.
Some people are co-parenting and they are all right partners, you know, but the sex is not there anymore, and they decide to try an open relationship. What are the risks that they need to consider when they are looking at that route?
Yeah. Opening relationships is a huge, huge topic, because it's obviously not going to be for every couple. Now, I think one of the biggest myths is that people in open or non-monogamous relationships don't get jealous. It's just not the case. It's just that they understand it and they have a different framework for it, and they have it in a different set of terms for them. It takes huge amounts of communication, huge amounts of work, understanding. It's not as simple as just doing it. Often people, when they're opening up, you know, exploring non-monogamy, there are a lot of stages of work that go before that. It's not as simple as we just decided and we're going to kind of act on this. But the risks are obviously that it doesn't work, or that it highlights something that the relationship doesn't have, or that we might form an attachment to someone else. But there are also risks of staying in relationships that aren't working, or relationships that are unhappy. But non-monogamy is different to cheating. It's different to infidelity. It's with the consent of everyone involved. And that is the difference. It is an agreement between those people. infidelity is one person or two people, but went against the rules of that, the invisible contract of that relationship.
And that breaks trust. But what about those people that started polyamorous relationships after being in monogamy? Like, is what you're saying is, if it's going to break the relationship, if I understood correctly, that means probably the relationship was not so happy in the first place, but it can make a relationship a better relationship for some.
Yeah.
And is there a way to experiment it safely, but then you can revert back to monogamy if that's not what's working for you?
Yeah, I think it's not a one-way street. It's not like you kind of get on the train and you can't get off, but couples have to decide at every stage. And I on my podcast interviewed an amazing therapist who works with non-monogamy called Nikki D, and she talks about this kind of multi-stage model where she will run sessions with couples where she says, okay, how would you feel if, a hypothetical example she gave was, your partner hasn't orgasmed with you for a year and you have your first kind of non-monogamous experience, you introduce someone else in and you see your partner having an amazing orgasm with this other person. How does that make you feel? And she asks these really difficult questions way before people are thinking about actually kind of the practicalities of doing this, because again, it's tapping into our insecurities, it's tapping into our anxieties. Now what we do with that is going to require an openness and a commitment to communication and a commitment to trust, a commitment to what are the boundaries we've set, what are the rules that we've set, and sticking to that. Because it's a different type of relationship model, but there's still relationships that are governed by rules, practices, agreements between people.
Comes back to that openness and being a team, essentially. Yeah. Fab. My last questions are, how can we educate our children about sex?
It's a big one.
Yeah.
One of the key pieces of advice we see across the board with this is it being kind of little and regular conversations, that we don't save it up as this big kind of birds and the bees conversation, that we don't kind of land it on our children like a kind of grenade, that we age appropriately, allow the conversations to kind of happen gently, we allow them to ask questions, we don't shame them for asking questions, and we work with what comes up. So if they come home from school and they say like, oh, like what's this, or I heard about that, or someone showed me this, use those as opportunities to have those conversations with your children, because then what you do is you make yourself the safe person for them to come and ask. They are going to be exposed to material, to people saying things, to, oh, like, did you hear about that? Or my big brother told me this. Or we can't protect them from all of that. But what you can do is be the person that they come to talk about that. And it's about also things like educating them about body parts, that they know like what their body parts are called, that they know the kind of correct language, from a health perspective, because they can then tell you what's going on, or if something feels funny, or if something's changed. But it's protective in that they know what parts of a body can't be touched by someone else, what parts can be touched, what they can say no to, what's for private and what's for public. And it's about trying to create a relationship for them which isn't rooted in shame, which is, okay, like, is that something you notice feels nice, but that's something we don't do in front of other people, or that's something that you can't do kind of publicly, or that, again, I had a brilliant conversation with someone on my podcast who, she's a coach for parents, basically, because most of us are modelling based on the kind of sex education that we might have had from our parents, or the conversations that we had in our households, but every generation is behind because they're being kind of caught up with the generations that they had teaching them. And as parents, we have to kind of take it on ourselves to educate ourselves to the level that we feel able to have the conversations, and also not feel afraid to say, I don't know how to answer that at the moment. Could I go away and have a think about it and I'll come back to you? And, you know, it's about little things like no means no, and please don't do that, or I don't like that, and also being able to name that. You know, autonomy over their bodies is important, but also understanding respect for other people's bodies as well.
definitely. I do that even in a playing context. Like, especially if girls, my son is friends with many girls, they will be like, I don't want to go on a swing. I'm like, she said no. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's it. Like, I'm very, as a mother of a boy, I'm very conscious of that.
Yeah.
No is a no. Like, I think we've done it brilliantly today. We answered lots of important questions, and I hope many people will find it interesting.
Okay, me too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you found this episode with Kate helpful, please follow us at do.not.disturb.podcast and share it with someone who needs it. You can find Kate at Kate Moyle Therapy. Her podcast and content are brilliant if you're ready to unlearn and reconnect. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on Do Not Disturb.
About sex, that it's going to sexualize them and that they're going to have sex earlier. And actually we see that the evidence is the opposite, that once we take away some of the mystery, the curiosity, once they feel educated, that they are more likely to make kind of delayed decisions, or that they are less kind of explorative for the sake of wanting to understand more. They're less likely to kind of seek out that kind of information, or they feel more educated to know what feels comfortable or uncomfortable for them.